honourable member for Cowichan-Malahat-Langford.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I will be speaking on what I think is a very misguided motion presented by the Liberal government. It is a fairly wordy motion, and I should say that there are some positive aspects, such as investing significantly in humanitarian assistance, increasing efforts to find political solutions to the conflict, and of course welcoming tens of thousands of refugees. However, the key point is that the Liberals have decided to expand and enlarge Canada's military mission in Iraq, and I cannot, in good faith, support this decision. This issue has been a point of contention within the Liberal Party for some time now. Canadians have watched them flip and flop back and forth on what should be done against ISIS. Indeed, the party seemed to disagree with itself at every turn, both opposing the military mission and supporting it. After months of waiting for the promise of bringing home our CFA teams, we find out that the Liberals have a new plan that has left more questions than answers regarding our role in this war. The most important part of this motion is missing. There are no parameters to define success. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, I am having trouble seeing more than cosmetic changes to the original Conservative mission. Again, we find ourselves calling it an advise and assist mission, exactly like the Conservatives did before. The Liberals are tripling these advisors to the Iraqi military, while some forces will be working within a battlefield context. The promise to end the bombing mission has morphed into an increased Canadian military presence, who will still be conducting targeting missions for other countries' bombers. The Liberals have stated in the past that there must be a clear line between combat and non-combat roles. Now, this is indeed a good point, but this motion before us makes that line even blurrier than before. We know that in practice, Canadian troops have already come under fire in the front lines with ISIS during their advise and assist mission. The Prime Minister cannot in good faith deny that troops will not be involved in combat. When we lost Sergeant Doiron, I think Canadians were starkly reminded of the risks to a deployment on the front line. The Prime Minister has not provided parameters for Canadian engagement on the ground for the duration of this expanded role. Afghanistan showed us that training missions, especially those within a battlefield context, are just as dangerous for our Canadian women and men as our active conflict zones. The government is now calling this an open-ended mission with no end date, and we all know how well that went in Afghanistan. But have no fear, because the Liberals have assured us that this open-ended mission will cost $264 million. This government is not being transparent with the people. If we do not know when this mission will end, how can we possibly know what it's going to cost? Now, the history of Western military intervention in the Middle East goes back centuries. The Crusades were the first of a series of organized campaigns, but it was not until the 19th century, starting with the Napoleonic Wars, that European powers unleashed a mad scramble to carve up the region. The modern-day borders, drawn as straight as a ruler, were imposed largely by the French and British on the remains of the Ottoman Empire at the end of World War I, and little regard was given to the different cultures, religious sects, and ethnic groups that were forced into the same national bed, the consequences of which we are still seeing to this day. The Kurds saw their homeland split between 5 different countries, including Syria, Iraq, and Turkey, 3 countries that are at the heart of the present conflict. We are sending weapons to the Kurds, which obviously raises many questions about the long-term consequences of such an action. I feel that this debate has not given enough answers on this issue. How do we make sure that these weapons do not fall into the wrong hands, or that human rights abuses will not be committed with these arms? Has the government given any long-term thought to the goals of the Kurds, which is to establish an independent state in the region? These questions have not been addressed, and they represent a glaring hole in our foreign policy for the region. There are other questions that have not been addressed with this motion. 3 years ago, ISIS did not exist. What conditions created a favorable climate for its rapid growth and the horrific atrocities it has committed? This is at the heart of the issue, and we ignore it at our peril. Simply put, ISIS is the product of a genocide that continued unabated as the world stood back and watched. It is the result of more than 200,000 murdered Syrians and millions more displaced and divorced from their hopes and dreams. It is no accident that ISIS has seen its growth in Sunni Arab territory in both Iraq and Syria. Both governments have fomented sectarian violence on their respective Sunni populations. The Liberal motion before us today shows that we have not learned our lessons from the 2003 U.S.-led invasion and occupation of Iraq, which created the chaos and conditions favorable to the rise of terrorism in the region. If we continue doing a military response to a problem that needs a political solution, we will never find success in the region. ISIS, like Al-Qaeda before it, is but the next head of the Hydra. We may cut it off only to find more have rushed in to replace it. Now, our men and women in the Canadian Forces do a fantastic job, and they will undertake any mission they are given expertly and professionally. The problem is that this is an ill-defined mission with no timelines or victory conditions. We went through this in Afghanistan, and we do not want to see that happen again. We always talk about giving our troops the tools they need, but we as parliamentarians also owe it to them to give them a clear mission with an exit strategy and goals for success. Another open-ended mission is just putting our troops in more danger. Now, since 2011, the unrest and conflict in Syria has led to over 4.5 million refugees fleeing to neighboring countries. This has led to a massive requirement for humanitarian solutions. It is not just the refugees who are hurting, but also 13.5 million people inside Syria who require urgent humanitarian intervention. We have an important role to play in addressing the threat that ISIS poses to the global community and in alleviating the suffering of civilians caught in the conflict. New Democrats have always been clear on this issue. There are things that must be done. Canada should absolutely not be playing a military combat role. We should focus on stopping the flow of arms, funds, and foreign fighters to ISIS. These actions would not only be effective, but they would be in line with the UN resolutions and mandates. The Liberal government has been silent on the signing of the Arms Trade Treaty. Ratifying this treaty would be a more effective deterrent to ISIS than actually contributing Canadian soldiers to the ground. The idea that we are actually ending the bombing mission is a ludicrous rationalization. We have changed the mission from actually dropping the bombs to one where we paint targets so that other countries may do the physical act of dropping a bomb. I may not throw the stick myself, but if I point to someone else who is throwing the stick, I am just as guilty. I am participating in that combat. Rationalizing in any other way does a disservice to this argument. I remember in the last Parliament when the Prime Minister criticized Conservatives because they wanted to increase Canada's participation in a vague and possibly endless combat mission. However, this is exactly what we see here. A Liberal government promising something and then hiding behind smoke and mirrors to act as if change is really happening. There is no way that the Liberal government can be honest if they claim that Canadian forces will not see combat in this expanded advise and assist role. The idea that augmenting a Conservative plan will make this a non-combat mission is not grounded in reality, Mr. Speaker. It is a good thing that the Liberals are bringing this debate to Parliament, and I hope that they see the points that the NDP are proposing so that we can have the most effective opposition to ISIS. We cannot just expand the Conservatives' advise and assist mission, putting even more boots on the ground and expect that we will solve this great problem through military means. New Democrats will continue to oppose this government motion while proposing alternative solutions to solve this crisis. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? Question et commentaire? The honourable member for Sarnia-Lambton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the member for his excellent speech. I'm actually interested to hear more about how he thinks we can reduce the recruitment of these extremists to the fight, both here and overseas.
Honourable member for Cowichan-Malahat-Langford.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague for the question. I alluded to some of that in my speech when I talked about the conditions that led to the rise of ISIS and extremism in Iraq. People don't just take up arms for no reason. There is a sufficient reason. I think if you look closely and at a detailed look at the way the Sunni Arab populations have been treated in Iraq and Syria, I think many of them have been driven to a form of extremism. There is no excuse for terrorism, but I'm trying to examine the conditions that have led to its rise. And, you know, this organization is attracting people from all around the world. I think one of the ways in which Canada can be effective is that we bring up a much-needed de-radicalization strategy here at home to prevent the flow of foreign fighters to the country, because it is just adding fuel to the fire there. Thank you.
Question commentaire, questions and comments. The honourable member for Pierrefonds-Dollard.
Mr. Speaker, the member makes a good point that we should try and understand what are the fundamental causes that brought ISIL to bear, and it's a commendable thing to do. However, we find ourselves here today, and I don't think anyone in this House would argue that ISIL is an enemy that needs to be defeated. So we're here today, it needs to be defeated. One side of the House would say, we'll do the fighting for you. The other member would say, we'll talk to you and try and talk you out of what you're doing. What we're saying is, we'll teach you to fight. There's an old saying, you can give a man a fish and feed him for a day, or you can teach him to fish and feed him for life. Our approach is to teach them to fish. We're not going to fight for them. We're not going to abandon them. We're going to teach them to fight. I would ask the member, how does that not work to stop ISIS?
Member for Cowichan-Malahat-Langford.
Well, I'm very happy to answer that question, Mr. Speaker. Since 2003, the Americans spent billions of dollars in Iraq trying to train Iraqi security forces. When ISIS came, the forces folded like a cheap tent. These forces are not going to be effective if one half of the population simply does not trust them. The problem is larger than just training forces on the ground. We have to arrive at a political solution. And the fact is in Iraq is that the Sunni and Shia Arab populations do not trust each other. Until those two populations can come together, having Iraq continue as we wish it to is simply an impossibility. Thank you.
Question commentaire. L'honorable député.
The honourable member for Hochelaga. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The last two colleagues who spoke raised points we hadn't discussed yet, new questions that we should ask ourselves that are fascinating, in fact. I'd like to get back to the question by my colleague for Laurier-Sainte-Marie, the type of training offered on the ground by Canada. We don't know exactly what's going to be offered. Her question was, will it be just military training or will it be humanitarian aid training? If it's exclusively military, we've just heard something from the last Liberal who spoke, who said we'll train them to fight. Well, if that's the Liberal vision, how is it different from the Conservative vision?
Cowichan-Malahat-Langford.
Well, that's a very good question by my colleague, and it goes right to the heart of what I'm saying, is that this motion is blurring the lines even further, and I think it is a bunch of smoke and mirrors. We are simply seeing the old Conservative mission is being changed somewhat. We're still having a military mission, still boots on the ground, and like I said before, I don't think that that is the most effective way that Canada can be using its resources. And based on what we have seen in the region over the last decade and more, it is not going to be successful. We cannot have a military solution to this problem. It needs to have a firm political solution on the ground, and I don't see enough effort being put into that particular area. Thank you.